By the beginning of 1916, the First World War had ground to a halt. The hopes of a swift victory had long since vanished, replaced by a grim and unyielding stalemate. A vast network of trenches, dugouts and barbed wire stretched for over 400 miles across Europe, from the cold waters of the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. These lines were not simple ditches, but complex systems with multiple layers, frontline trenches, support trenches and reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches. This was the Western Front, a brutal landscape of mud, barbed wire and death. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a wasteland of shell craters, shattered trees and the remains of failed attacks. The initial German invasion had captured large parts of Belgium and northern France, and for 2 years the Allies, primarily Britain and France, had been trying to push them back. The Germans had dug in, fortifying their positions with concrete bunkers, deep dugouts and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The war had become a stalemate, a grim contest of attrition where both sides dug in, unable to land a decisive blow. Every attempt to break through was met with devastating artillery barrages and withering machine gun fire. Life in the trenches was a miserable existence, defined by constant fear, shelling and the ever-present threat of attack. Soldiers endured endless mud, lice and rats with little shelter from the elements or the enemy's guns. The year 1916 brought a new crisis for the Allies. Commanders on both sides sought ways to break the deadlock, experimenting with new tactics and technologies from poison gas to creeping barrages. In February, the German army launched a massive surprise attack on the French fortress city of Verdun. The Germans hoped to draw in French reserves and inflict maximum casualties. The German strategy was simple and terrifying: to bleed the French army white. Verdun became a symbol of national resistance, with both sides pouring in men and material in a battle of endurance. They intended to throw so much firepower and so many men at Verdun that the French would be forced to defend it at any cost, draining their army of soldiers and spirit. The fighting raged for months, with little ground gained but enormous losses on both sides. The fighting was ferocious, and the French army began to buckle under the immense pressure. The defenders rotated constantly, with entire divisions cycling through the inferno. A collapse at Verdun could have meant a German victory in the war, a possibility that sent shockwaves through the Allied command. The need for a diversion to relieve pressure on Verdun became urgent. The need to do something, anything, to relieve the French became desperately urgent. The Allies began to accelerate plans for a major offensive elsewhere on the front. Before the crisis at Verdun erupted, the British and French had already been planning a joint offensive. The goal was to break through the German lines and restore movement to the war. They chose a relatively quiet sector of the front along the gentle rolling hills of the Somme River in Picardy. The area was thought to be less heavily defended, offering a chance for a breakthrough. The original idea was for a large French-led assault with British support. The French would provide the bulk of the manpower, with the British attacking on their left. However, the German attack on Verdun changed everything. The French were forced to divert their reserves to the defence of Verdun, leaving the British to take the lead in the planned offensive. With the French army fighting for its life, they could no longer lead the charge. The British, many of whom were new to large-scale offensives, now bore the main responsibility. The responsibility shifted to the British and their Empire forces. Men from across the globe gathered for what would become one of the largest battles in history. The Somme offensive was no longer just about gaining ground. It was now a desperate mission to save their most important ally, and to draw German forces away from Verdun. The British army that gathered on the Somme was a new kind of force. It was the largest British army ever assembled, and it included men from every corner of the United Kingdom and the Empire. It was largely made up of volunteers, men who had answered Lord Kitchener's famous call to arms in 1914. These were the so-called New Armies, raised in a wave of patriotic enthusiasm. These were not professional soldiers, but civilians in uniform, clerks, farmers, miners, and factory workers, all filled with a sense of patriotic duty. They trained hard, but few could imagine the horrors that awaited them. They were eager and brave, but they were also inexperienced in the harsh realities of modern industrial warfare. The trenches of the Western Front would be their true test. They were about to face one of the most heavily fortified defensive lines ever constructed, bristling with machine guns, artillery, and layers of barbed wire. The lessons they would learn would be paid for at an unimaginable price. The quiet fields of the Somme were about to become the stage for one of history's bloodiest battles, a turning point that would define the Western Front in 1916 and shape the course of the entire war. The British plan for the Battle of the Somme was ambitious, shaped not only by military strategy but also by intense political pressure and the desperate realities of a war that had become a grinding stalemate. The main military goal was to achieve a decisive breakthrough on the Western Front. British and French commanders envisioned their soldiers smashing through the German front line on the first day, advancing nearly 6 miles and capturing the key town of Bapaume. But behind this, political motivations loomed large. The French army was under immense strain at Verdun, and the British were under pressure from their government and allies to relieve the French and demonstrate their commitment to the war effort. The plan was bold and deceptively simple. A massive infantry assault would follow the largest artillery bombardment the world had ever seen. Yet the logistics behind this were staggering. Over 1 million men, thousands of guns, and mountains of ammunition had to be moved, supplied, and coordinated across muddy, shell-torn roads and railways, all while maintaining secrecy and readiness. The British commander, General Sir Douglas Haig, believed that overwhelming force and firepower could break the deadlock and restore a war of movement, leaving the static misery of the trenches behind. Haig and his staff were convinced that meticulous planning and the sheer scale of the attack would ensure success. Yet among the ranks, opinions varied. Some officers worried about the strength of German defences, while others placed their faith in the new tactics and technology. The battlefield of 1916 presented enormous challenges to any attacking force. The landscape was a wasteland of mud, shattered trees, and tangled trenches. Technology had fundamentally changed the nature of war, giving a massive advantage to the defender. Logistical difficulties plagued every aspect of the operation, from moving men and supplies to maintaining communication lines under constant bombardment. Barbed wire, laid in thick, tangled belts, could stop an infantry advance in its tracks, holding soldiers in the open where they were most vulnerable. Engineers and sappers faced the daunting task of clearing these obstacles, often under enemy fire, and many soldiers feared the wire more than the bullets. The machine gun had become the king of the battlefield, a single weapon capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute and cutting down waves of advancing men. British soldiers knew that crossing no man's land meant facing a wall of lead, and many doubted whether any plan could truly neutralize these deadly positions. Artillery, too, had become more powerful and accurate, able to rain down a storm of high-explosive shells on any target. The British placed enormous faith in their guns, believing that a sustained bombardment would destroy the enemy's defences and clear the way for the infantry. Overcoming these deadly modern weapons was the central problem facing the British planners. Intelligence was often incomplete or outdated, and the true strength of the German positions was underestimated. Many soldiers, waiting in the trenches, sensed the scale of the challenge ahead and wrote letters home expressing both hope and dread. To solve this problem, the British put their faith entirely in their artillery. The plan hinged on a colossal 7-day preliminary bombardment requiring a vast logistical effort to supply and coordinate over 1,000 guns and millions of shells. Over 1,500 British guns were assembled, and they were tasked with firing more than 1.5 million shells onto the German positions. The hope was that this overwhelming firepower would break the enemy's will and ability to resist. The generals believed this unprecedented barrage would accomplish several key objectives. It was meant to obliterate the German trenches, flatten the barbed wire, and most importantly, destroy the German machine gun posts and kill the soldiers manning them. The infantry would then advance into what was expected to be a devastated and undefended zone. The idea was that the artillery would do all the hard work, leaving the infantry with little more to do than walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered enemy lines. Many soldiers, however, were uneasy, aware that the reality of battle rarely matched the optimism of headquarters. This over-reliance on the artillery bombardment was the plan's greatest weakness. The British were confident that nothing could survive such a sustained shelling, but some commanders and many men in the ranks harboured doubts, shaped by bitter experience and the memory of failed attacks. They expected the German defences to be completely annihilated. As a result, the infantry was instructed to advance at a steady walking pace, burdened with heavy equipment, assuming there would be little resistance left to fight. This decision would prove fateful, as it left the men exposed and slow-moving in the face of any surviving defenders. It was a strategy based on a massive assumption, one that failed to account for the ingenuity and resilience of the German defenders. The Germans had constructed deep bunkers and reinforced positions, and their commanders anticipated the bombardment, preparing their men to survive and respond with deadly force. This miscalculation, rooted in political urgency, logistical complexity, and a dangerous underestimation of the enemy, would have catastrophic consequences when the whistles blew and the men went over the top, stepping into the unknown with hope, fear, and grim determination. As the British meticulously planned their offensive, the German army was far from passive. Instead, they dedicated nearly 2 years to transforming their stretch of the Somme front into an almost impenetrable stronghold. The Germans adopted a defensive doctrine centered on depth and resilience. Their engineers and soldiers constructed a vast system of trenches, not just a single line, but a labyrinth of interconnected defences stretching for miles. The first line, closest to the enemy, was only the beginning. Behind it, secondary and even tertiary lines provided fallback positions, each one fortified and ready to absorb an assault if the front was breached. These lines were arranged in depth, with each layer designed to slow, exhaust, and ultimately halt any attacking force. The complexity of the network made it nearly impossible for attackers to achieve a quick breakthrough. The front line was supported by additional trenches to the rear, each one a formidable obstacle, complete with firing steps, parapets, and reinforced positions for machine guns. Communication trenches zigzagged between the main lines, allowing for the safe movement of troops, ammunition, and messages, all while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The most critical element of the German defense, and the one most underestimated by the British, was the deep dugout. These underground shelters were feats of engineering, designed to withstand even the heaviest bombardments. Many German soldiers were skilled miners, and they used their expertise to tunnel deep into the chalky earth of the Somme, creating shelters far below the surface. These dugouts, often 30 feet or more underground, were reinforced with timber and concrete, providing protection from all but the most direct hits. When British artillery shells rained down, the deep dugouts remained largely untouched, rendering the massive bombardment ineffective against the defenders below. Inside these shelters, German soldiers endured the relentless noise and shaking earth, but they were shielded from the worst of the destruction. The psychological strain was immense, Hours or days spent in darkness, listening to the world above being torn apart, not knowing when they would be called to fight. The British artillery bombardment, though unprecedented in scale, failed to achieve its main goals, breaking the German lines and cutting the barbed wire. The shelling transformed the landscape into a nightmarish expanse of mud and craters, but the barbed wire defences remained largely intact. Many shells used were shrapnel, designed to kill exposed troops, not to destroy thick wire. The high-explosive shells, meanwhile, often failed to detonate or lacked the power to reach the deep dugouts. Unexploded shells and undamaged dugouts were a testament to the limitations of the British bombardment. For the German soldiers below, the psychological toll was severe. The constant thunder of shells, the trembling earth, and the knowledge that at any moment they might be ordered to the surface created a unique kind of dread. Above ground, the British believed they had annihilated the defenders, seeing only a devastated, lifeless landscape. But as dawn broke on July 1st, 1916, the German soldiers, mentally prepared by days of bombardment, knew exactly what was about to happen. At the signal, they emerged from their deep shelters, quickly manning their positions and setting up machine guns along the parapets, ready to repel the assault. They watched as lines of British soldiers advanced methodically across no man's land, unaware of the intact defences awaiting them. The barbed wire was unbroken, the defenders unscathed. The British attack was about to meet the full force of the German defence. The psychological strain on both sides was immense, attackers facing the unknown, defenders bracing for the onslaught after days of tension and fear. The German fortress had held firm. Before the first British soldier even reached the enemy trenches, the plan had already unravelled, and the true horror of trench warfare was about to be revealed. The 1st of July, 1916, dawned as a bright, clear summer's day on the Somme. For many it would become a day of harsh and unforgettable lessons. At 7:30 in the morning, a signal echoed along the British line. Whistles blew, and 120,000 men rose from their trenches to launch the long-planned assault. The result was catastrophic. It became the single deadliest day in the history of the British Army, a grim testament to the cost of inexperience and flawed planning. As the infantry advanced, they were met by a relentless storm of machine gun and rifle fire from German defenders who had weathered the week-long bombardment in deep dugouts. In many sectors, entire waves of men were cut down within minutes, their bodies tangled on the uncut barbed wire, evidence of the failure to neutralize German defences. The leadership, convinced that the artillery would destroy enemy positions, had ordered the infantry to advance at a walking pace. This decision proved tragically misguided. The enduring image of men walking into machine gun fire is only part of the story. Some officers, recognizing the danger, tried to adapt on the spot. Along the 18-mile front, units experimented with different tactics. Some ordered their men to move in short rushes, others to crawl or use shell holes for cover. In certain sectors, officers commanded their troops to sprint across no man's land, hoping speed would reduce casualties. Elsewhere, sappers had dug forward tunnels known as saps, allowing assault troops to begin their attack closer to the enemy lines, a tactic that sometimes caught defenders off guard. In some areas the advance was coordinated with a creeping barrage, artillery fire moving just ahead of the infantry. This innovation, though promising, was difficult to execute perfectly. Yet in the northern and central sectors, where German defences were strongest, none of these adaptations could overcome the well-prepared enemy. German machine gunners, positioned in reinforced emplacements, unleashed devastating fire, halting the British advance and inflicting appalling losses. By nightfall, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The battlefield was a scene of devastation, with exhausted and wounded men scattered across the ground. The British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including over 19,000 killed, an unprecedented loss in a single day. Thousands of men lay dead or dying in the shell-cratered landscape, and the territorial gains were negligible. Most attacking divisions failed to reach the German front line, let alone break through it. The plan for a decisive breakthrough had collapsed. In the north, the attack was a complete failure, with units forced to retreat to their starting positions. The new volunteer army, many of them inexperienced, received a brutal initiation into modern warfare. The shock and grief reverberated through regiments and communities for years to come. The day ended in a stunning and horrific defeat for British arms, a sobering lesson in the realities of industrialized war. Yet the first day was not a story of uniform failure. Some sectors saw different outcomes shaped by leadership decisions and tactical improvisation. In the southern part of the line, the attack achieved greater success. Here, officers coordinated more closely with artillery, and the German defences were less formidable. The artillery was more effective, and some units managed to capture their objectives, advancing into German-held villages such as Mametz and Montauban. These advances, though limited, demonstrated the potential of improved coordination and evolving tactics. Further south, the French army, employing superior artillery and different assault methods, achieved most of their objectives with far fewer casualties, highlighting the importance of tactical evolution. These isolated successes offered a glimmer of hope, but they could not disguise the fact that the grand plan for a breakthrough had failed. The early phases of the Somme were a brutal education in the realities of modern warfare, forcing commanders and soldiers alike to confront the need for new tactics, better planning, and hard-earned experience. The catastrophic losses of the first day forced the British High Command to abandon their dream of a swift breakthrough. The sheer scale of casualties, nearly 60,000 on July 1st alone, shocked commanders and soldiers alike, revealing the futility of outdated tactics against modern defences. The initial plan, which relied on a prolonged artillery bombardment followed by massed infantry advances, had failed disastrously. German defences, deep dugouts and interlocking machine gun fire proved far more resilient than anticipated. The Battle of the Somme could not simply be called off, however, as the French were still under immense pressure at Verdun. The British had to continue the offensive, but it was clear that their approach needed to change. The French, too, were adapting. At Verdun they had begun to rotate units more frequently and use counter-battery fire to suppress German artillery, lessons that would soon influence British tactics as well. The British Army began a painful and costly learning process, experimenting with new ways to overcome the deadlock of trench warfare. Commanders realized that rigid, linear attacks only led to slaughter. Training was overhauled. Infantry units practiced new assault techniques, including moving in small groups, using cover, and coordinating more closely with artillery. Innovations included the introduction of the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward in stages just ahead of the advancing infantry, providing a moving shield. The remainder of the battle would be characterized not by one grand assault, but by a series of smaller, more carefully planned attacks. These limited offensives allowed for better coordination and reduced the risk of catastrophic losses. Each attack was preceded by detailed reconnaissance and planning, with objectives set to be achievable and sustainable. The harsh lessons of July 1st were incorporated into every new operation. Orders emphasized flexibility and initiative at the platoon and company level. One of the most important tactical shifts was the move towards surprise attacks. The 7-day bombardment had given the Germans ample warning, allowing them to shelter in deep dugouts and prepare their defences. For the next major attack on Byzantine Ridge 2 weeks later, the British used a much shorter, more intense hurricane bombardment that lasted only a few hours. This was combined with a daring night assault, with troops moving into position under the cover of darkness. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack caught the Germans by surprise, and the British captured a significant section of high ground. This success demonstrated that speed and surprise were far more effective than the brute force of the initial plan. The Germans, for their part, adapted quickly. They deepened their dugouts, improved their barbed wire defences, and developed new counterattack tactics, often launching immediate counter-assaults to retake lost ground. German artillery observers became adept at calling down defensive barrages, and machine gunners learned to sweep no man's land with enfilading fire. The British responded by increasing the use of specialised units such as bombing squads armed with grenades, and by integrating new weapons like the Stokes mortar and the Lewis gun. These innovations allowed for greater firepower and flexibility at the front line, helping to overcome German strongpoints. After-action debriefings became routine, with lessons learned from each attack quickly disseminated to other units. The British also began to experiment with combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, artillery and engineers to breach enemy lines and consolidate gains. Innovation was not limited to large-scale attacks. The British developed clever tricks to deceive the enemy, such as the so-called Chinese attack. In these feints, troops would make a great deal of noise, bang on ladders and fix bayonets as if preparing to go over the top. The goal was to trick the Germans into manning their trenches, exposing them to a renewed and pre-planned artillery barrage. These ruses sometimes succeeded in drawing German troops out of their deep shelters at precisely the wrong moment. Similarly, machine guns began to be used in a new way, firing indirectly over long distances in a machine gun barrage. This allowed the British to saturate areas like Delville Wood with thousands of rounds, preventing German reinforcements from moving up. The Germans, in turn, adapted by constructing even deeper shelters and developing new camouflage techniques to conceal their positions from aerial observation and artillery spotting. Both sides engaged in a constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, with each new tactic quickly met by a response from the enemy. As the battle dragged on, the British and their allies refined the bite-and-hold tactic. Instead of trying to break through the German lines in one go, the new approach was to bite off a small, manageable piece of the enemy's front line. Once the objective was taken, the soldiers would immediately dig in and consolidate their position, preparing for the inevitable German counterattack. This methodical, step-by-step approach was slow and grueling, but it was far more effective at holding on to captured ground and gradually wearing down the German defenders. The Germans, meanwhile, shifted to a defense-in-depth strategy, creating multiple lines of trenches and strong points to absorb attacks and launch counter-offensives. Both sides suffered heavy losses as each adaptation was met with new challenges and setbacks. The Somme became a laboratory of tactical evolution, with every advance and every failure shaping the future of warfare. By the end of the battle, both the British and Germans had learned hard lessons about the realities of modern industrialized war. The Somme was no longer about rapid victory, but about survival, adaptation, and the relentless grind of attrition. The innovations and setbacks experienced here would echo throughout the remainder of the war, shaping tactics on every front. The Somme became a grinding battle of attrition, a bloody education in modern war. The cost was immense, but the tactical evolution on both sides would change the face of warfare forever. The legacy of the Somme was written not just in blood, but in the hard-won knowledge of how to fight and survive on the modern battlefield. The Battle of the Somme is often remembered as a British tragedy, but in reality it was a vast multinational operation involving close cooperation between the French army and the forces of the British Empire. The French and Commonwealth contributions were not only significant in scale, but also in their impact on the course of the battle. The French army under General Ferdinand Foch and General Émile Fayolle played a pivotal and often underappreciated role. At the outset, the French committed the 6th Army, including the 20th and 35th Army Corps, to the southern sector of the Somme front. On July 1, 1916, while the British Fourth Army suffered catastrophic losses in the north, French divisions such as the 18th and 39th Infantry Divisions advanced rapidly south of the Somme River, capturing key objectives like Dompierre and Fay. The French advantage lay in their superior artillery, with over 900 guns supporting their assault. Their infantry, battle-hardened from Verdun, used flexible tactics and close coordination with artillery to outmaneuver German defenders. French units like the 153rd Infantry Regiment achieved their objectives with relatively light casualties, demonstrating tactical proficiency that set an example for their British allies. Throughout the campaign, French and British forces coordinated major offensives, with French attacks at Belloy-en-Santerre and Harcourt, drawing in German reserves and easing pressure on British lines. The British Empire's contribution was immense, with divisions from across the Commonwealth, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland and India, fighting alongside British regulars and territorials. The Australian Imperial Force, particularly the 1st, 2nd and 4th Australian Divisions, was heavily engaged in the Somme's fiercest battles. Their main objective was the village of Pozières, a fortified position on the Albert-Bapaume road, which was vital for the German defensive line. After initial attacks by the 1st Australian Division met fierce resistance, the 2nd and 4th Divisions launched repeated assaults, eventually capturing Pozières after weeks of brutal close-quarters combat. The struggle continued at Mouquet Farm, where the Australian divisions faced the elite German 1st Guard Reserve Division. The farm changed hands multiple times, with the Australians suffering heavy losses in repeated attacks. In just 6 weeks, the Australian forces lost over 23,000 men at Pozières and Mouquet Farm, a testament to their determination and sacrifice. Other Commonwealth units also paid a heavy price. The 1st Battalion, New Zealand Rifle Brigade, and the 16th Canadian Scottish Battalion distinguished themselves in the fighting. The 1st Newfoundland Regiment, part of the 29th British Division, was nearly annihilated at Beaumont Hamel on July 1st, with over 700 casualties out of 801 men in less than half an hour. Canadian forces, including the 22nd French-Canadian Battalion and the 2nd Canadian Division, entered the battle in September, playing a decisive role in the capture of Courcelette and Regina Trench. The South African Brigade, part of the 9th Scottish Division, was tasked with seizing and holding Delville Wood, a key position near Longueval. Ordered to hold the wood at all costs, the South Africans entered on July 15th and faced relentless German counterattacks. For 6 days, the South African Brigade, including the 1st, 2nd and 4th South African Infantry Regiments, endured constant shell fire and hand-to-hand combat, repelling repeated assaults. When finally relieved, only 143 of the original 3,153 men emerged unscathed, their stand becoming legendary in South African military history. The Somme was a truly global battle, with Allied units from across the world fighting side by side. Indian cavalry of the 2nd Indian Cavalry Division supported attacks, while the 36th Ulster Division from Ireland distinguished itself at Thiepval. Men from England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland fought and died, next to men from France, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Newfoundland and India, forging bonds of brotherhood in the trenches. Each nation brought its own regimental traditions, tactics and courage to the battlefield, and all shared in the immense sacrifice and hardship. The Somme was not merely a struggle for territory, but a crucible of Allied cooperation and sacrifice. The legacy of the French and Commonwealth units, etched in memorials and cemeteries, remains a powerful reminder of the scale and unity of the Allied effort in the First World War. By September 1916, the Battle of the Somme had persisted for over 2 months, with both Allied and German forces locked in a costly stalemate. The initial optimism for a rapid breakthrough had faded, replaced by a relentless struggle for every inch of ground as both sides endured heavy casualties and unyielding conditions. Exhaustion and attrition defined the front, with the deadlock appearing insurmountable. In response, the British High Command sought a technological solution to break the impasse, turning to a secret project that had been under development since 1915. This project produced a new type of armoured fighting vehicle, engineered to traverse cratered terrain, crush barbed wire and neutralise entrenched machine gun positions. To maintain operational secrecy, the vehicle was codenamed Tank during its development and production phases. The first operational model, the British Mark I, was a pioneering but rudimentary machine. The Mark I was slow, cumbersome and plagued by frequent mechanical failures. Its top speed barely exceeded walking pace, and its engine was highly susceptible to breakdowns. Inside, the crew operated in extreme heat, deafening noise and toxic fumes, making conditions hazardous and exhausting. The Mark I's armour could withstand small arms fire, but it was vulnerable to direct artillery hits, limiting its survivability on the battlefield. Despite these limitations, the tank represented a revolutionary advancement in military technology, introducing the concept of armoured, mobile firepower to the battlefield. The tank's armour rendered it impervious to rifle and machine gun fire, and its imposing presence was designed to demoralise enemy infantry. British commanders anticipated that the psychological and physical impact of the tank could create a breach in the German defensive lines. The tank's combat debut occurred on September 15, 1916, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, a phase of the Somme offensive. Of the 49 tanks deployed, many succumbed to mechanical failure or became immobilized in the mud before reaching enemy positions. Only a small number of tanks managed to engage in direct combat. Those that did participate demonstrated the tank's potential by crushing obstacles and providing direct fire support. The appearance of these armoured vehicles caused significant shock among German defenders, who had never encountered such machines. In several sectors, German troops abandoned their positions in panic, allowing Allied forces to advance. Supported by a coordinated, creeping artillery barrage, the tanks enabled British and Canadian infantry to advance over a mile and secure the village of Flers. However, the initial deployment of tanks did not deliver the decisive breakthrough that had been hoped for. The limited number of operational vehicles and their mechanical unreliability prevented sustained exploitation of the initial gains. Once the element of surprise dissipated, German forces adapted quickly, employing artillery and specialized anti-tank rifles to counter the new threat. Many senior officers remained skeptical about the tank's effectiveness, citing its technical shortcomings and logistical demands. Nevertheless, the tank's battlefield debut revealed its potential as a transformative weapon in modern warfare. The tank was an imperfect but innovative response to the tactical challenges of trench warfare. The Somme marked the tank's operational debut, a flawed beginning, but one that signalled the advent of armoured warfare, fundamentally altering the conduct of 20th century battles. As autumn set in, the nature of the fighting on the Somme changed once again. The High Command on both sides faced a grim reality. The grand offensives of summer had failed to deliver a decisive breakthrough, and the cost in men and materiel was staggering. The weather turned, and relentless rain transformed the battlefield into a quagmire of deep clinging mud. Commanders struggled to adapt their strategies as the ground itself became the enemy. The shell-blasted ground became a vast swamp, making any movement incredibly difficult. Supply lines faltered, and even the simplest maneuvers required immense effort. Tanks bogged down, shells disappeared without exploding into the soupy earth, and soldiers could drown in the water-filled shell holes. The new technology that had promised so much was rendered almost useless by the conditions. The grand-scale attacks of the summer were no longer possible. Both sides shifted to a strategy of attrition, seeking to wear down the enemy through constant pressure and limited advances. The battle devolved into a series of smaller attritional fights for specific heavily fortified objectives that had resisted capture since July, such as the Thiepval Ridge and the Houben redoubt. German commanders, recognizing the importance of these positions, poured in reserves and reinforced their defences. The fighting for these last German strongholds was some of the most intense of the entire battle. Both sides committed fresh divisions, and the struggle for every trench and bunker was bitter and costly. The Houben redoubt, a maze of trenches and machine-gun posts north of Thiepval, had held out against repeated British attacks since the first day. German machine-gunners, well supplied and determined, inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. The landscape was a lunar wasteland with no recognizable features left, just an endless sea of craters and corpses. Commanders on both sides struggled to orient themselves and coordinate attacks. The final capture of these positions was achieved through brutal close-quarters fighting with grenades and bayonets. The cost in lives was enormous, but the British and French were determined to press on. The exhausted troops pushed forward inch by inch, capturing one shell hole at a time in a desperate struggle against an equally determined enemy. German counterattacks were frequent and ferocious, but the Allies slowly gained ground. With both armies at the point of collapse, the British High Command, led by General Haig, resolved to launch one last major effort in mid-November. The aim was to secure a more defensible line for the winter and to achieve some tangible success before the year's end. This was the Battle of the Ancre, an attack on the northern end of the Somme front. The operation was meticulously planned, with improved artillery coordination and the use of remaining tanks. The goal was to secure a better defensive line for the winter and capture objectives that had been intended for the first day of the battle, like the village of Beaumont-Hamel. The attack was launched in the early morning under cover of thick fog. Aided by a heavy morning fog that concealed their advance, along with improved artillery techniques and a few of the remaining tanks, the British forces finally achieved a significant success. The German defenders, exhausted and short of supplies, were unable to hold. Troops from the Royal Naval Division and the Highland Divisions captured their objectives, a symbolic victory after months of failure. The fall of Beaumont-Hamel marked the end of a long and costly struggle for the British. Despite these late successes, it was clear that the battle had reached its end. Both armies were exhausted, their ranks thinned by casualties and disease. The soldiers were too exhausted and the ground was too waterlogged to exploit the breakthrough. The German command, recognizing the futility of further resistance in such conditions, began to withdraw to more defensible positions. The first snows of winter began to fall on the battlefield, bringing a final grim halt to the fighting. The guns fell silent, and both sides took stock of the devastation. On November 18, 1916, the Battle of the Somme officially petered out. The Allies had advanced only a few miles, and the front lines remained largely unchanged. After 4.5 months of relentless combat, the guns fell silent over a landscape of utter devastation. The cost was staggering: over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing on both sides. The battle had been a long, agonizing grind, a war of attrition that had pushed both sides to their absolute limits. For the Allies, the Somme was a costly lesson in modern warfare, and for the Germans it marked the beginning of a slow, grinding retreat that would continue for the rest of the war. The final phase of the Somme left scars, physical and psychological, that would endure long after the guns had fallen silent. The Battle of the Somme concluded in November 1916, not with triumph, but with both sides utterly spent, an ending marked by exhaustion rather than victory. The scale of human loss was staggering, so vast it defies true comprehension. The British and their Empire allies suffered over 420,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The French endured losses of around 200,000 men, German casualties were equally catastrophic, estimated between 450,000 and 600,000. In total, over 1 million men became casualties for a strip of ground, muddy, shattered, and only about 30 miles long and 6 miles deep. The Somme has become a byword for the tragic futility of the First World War, its name forever linked to unimaginable sacrifice. Judged by its original objectives, the battle was a failure. The much-anticipated breakthrough never came, and the town of Bapaume remained uncaptured. The British Army failed to shatter the German lines or restore a war of movement. For decades, the Somme has been condemned as a senseless bloodbath, blamed on the failures of high command. The enduring image is of brave men sent to their deaths, their sacrifice shaping the collective memory of the war. The catastrophic first day in particular has come to symbolize the tragic gulf between generals in their chateaux and the men enduring the trenches. Yet to view the Somme only through a tactical lens is to overlook its deeper legacy. Strategically, the Somme was a costly but essential success for the Allies. Most crucially, it achieved its revised aim, relieving the French at Verdun and preventing a collapse that could have lost the war. By forcing the Germans to divert divisions and resources, the British attack at the Somme saved the French army from disaster. The battle also inflicted devastating losses on the German army from which it never fully recovered. One German general later admitted that after the Somme, his army was so depleted it could hardly be called an army at all. The Somme stands as a tragic turning point, a moment that changed the course of the war and left scars that would last for generations. It was in the mud and fire of the Somme that the inexperienced British volunteer army was forged into a hardened professional force. The hard-won lessons in tactics, technology, and leadership would prove vital for the victories of 1918. Innovations such as the tank, the creeping barrage, and the refinement of bite and hold tactics all emerged from the crucible of the Somme. The legacy of the Somme endures in military doctrine, in the memorials that bear the names of the fallen, and in the collective memory of a generation marked by loss. It was a battle that prevented Allied defeat in 1916, but at a cost that forever changed the way war is remembered. Before the assault waves ever left their trenches, the Battle of the Somme was shaped by the thunder of artillery. Over 1,500 British guns lined the front, joined by hundreds more from the French, an arsenal unmatched in scale at that point in history. Their mission was clear: obliterate the German defences, cut the barbed wire, and pave the way for the infantry. The artillery barrage began on June 24, 1916, lasting a full week. A relentless bombardment designed to shatter not only the enemy's trenches, but also their morale. British gunners fired over 1.5 million shells in this opening salvo, using a range of weaponry. Field guns, howitzers, and massive siege pieces like the 15-inch howitzer all played a role. Specialized shells, from high explosive to shrapnel, were intended to cut wire, collapse dugouts, and blanket no man's land with lethal fragments. Yet the reality was far more complicated. Many shells failed to explode, and the German defences, deeply dug and reinforced, often survived the onslaught. When the infantry advanced, they found much of the wire still intact and the defenders ready. The promise that not even a rat would survive proved tragically hollow. Still, the Somme marked a turning point in artillery warfare. Commanders learned hard lessons about coordination, precision, and the need for new tactics. The creeping barrage, a moving curtain of fire that advanced just ahead of the infantry, was refined during these months, offering crucial protection and helping to breach enemy lines in later battles. Technological innovation accelerated. Sound ranging and flash spotting improved the detection of enemy guns. New fuses and better shell designs increased reliability and destructive power. By the end of the battle, artillery had evolved from blunt instrument to a more sophisticated weapon, central to the tactics of modern war. The battered landscape of the Somme was a testament to this new era. Craters, shattered trees, and twisted wire marked where the guns had spoken. For the men on the ground, artillery was both a shield and a terror, capable of saving lives or ending them in an instant. The role of artillery at the Somme was profound. It shaped the battlefield, dictated the pace of attacks, and forced changes in both strategy and technology. Its thunder echoed far beyond 1916, setting the pattern for war on the Western Front and beyond. In the chaos and confusion of the Somme, victory or disaster often hinged on the flow of information. Communication and intelligence, though less visible than shells or bayonets, were lifelines for every unit on the battlefield. The trenches were threaded with miles of telephone and telegraph wires, strung just below the mud, or hastily draped along trench walls. These lines allowed commanders to issue orders and receive reports, so long as they weren't severed by shell fire, which happened frequently. When the wires went dead, runners, young soldiers carrying written messages, braved no man's land, dodging bullets and explosions to keep the chain of command intact. Signallers played a crucial role, using coloured flags, lamps, and even carrier pigeons to send coded messages across the lines. Whistles and bugles conveyed simple commands in the din of battle, but these sounds were often lost in the thunder of artillery. Semaphore flags and Morse code lamps offered other options, though both demanded clear sightlines and steady nerves. Above the trenches, observation balloons and fragile biplanes soared into the sky. Their mission to spot enemy positions, direct artillery fire, and map the ever-shifting front. Pilots and observers scribbled notes and dropped message canisters, while aerial photographs provided commanders with a bird's-eye view of the battlefield for the first time in history. Reconnaissance patrols crept through the darkness, risking capture or death to gather intelligence from enemy lines. Despite ingenious methods, communication was never guaranteed. Wires snapped, runners disappeared, and signals were misunderstood. Yet the relentless effort to gather and relay information shaped every decision, every attack, and every retreat. At the Somme, the lessons learned in communication and intelligence would ripple through the rest of the war. New technologies emerged, from portable radios to encrypted codes, but in 1916 it was grit, resourcefulness, and the courage to cross a shattered landscape that held armies together, one message at a time. As the guns roared and the mud churned on the Somme, a parallel battle unfolded behind the front lines. A fight to save the wounded. For every soldier who charged into no man's land, a network of stretcher-bearers, orderlies, and doctors braced for the relentless tide of casualties. The moment a man fell, his ordeal had only begun. Stretcher teams, often under fire, navigated the cratered terrain to reach the injured. Each journey was a race against time and the elements: mud sucking at boots, shells bursting overhead, and bullets snapping through the haze. Once retrieved, the wounded were rushed to regimental aid posts, little more than dugouts or sandbagged shelters near the trenches. Here the most urgent wounds were stemmed, bleeding staunched, shattered limbs splinted, and pain eased with precious doses of morphine. From the aid post, a chain of evacuation unfolded. Horse-drawn ambulances, motor lorries, and even converted buses ferried men back through dressing stations and casualty clearing stations. Each stop brought better equipment and more skilled surgeons, but also more grim realities: the need to make quick decisions, to prioritize who could be saved, and to accept that many would not survive the journey. Field hospitals, hastily erected tents or commandeered barns, became islands of hope and despair. Here doctors performed life-saving surgeries, often with limited supplies and under the constant threat of enemy shells. Innovations emerged, from necessity antiseptics to fight infection, splints to stabilize broken bones, and new techniques for treating shock and gas injuries. Blood transfusions, still experimental, offered a lifeline to the gravely wounded. Amidst the chaos, discipline and determination kept the medical services running. Every man in the chain, from stretcher-bearer to surgeon, faced exhaustion and horror. Yet their courage and ingenuity saved thousands who might otherwise have been lost to history. The Somme's medical lessons would shape the future of battlefield care. But in 1916 each life saved was a triumph over impossible odds, proof that even in war's darkest hours compassion could endure. As the guns finally fell silent along the Somme, a battered landscape was left behind. Fields, once vibrant, now churned into a desolate wasteland of mud, wire, and shattered trees. The aftermath of battle brought new challenges for those who remained. Clearing the debris of war became a monumental task. Men laboured to recover the fallen, mark graves, and remove shells that still lurked beneath the soil. The land, scarred by shell holes and trenches, required years of effort to reclaim. Farmers slowly returned, turning over the earth in search of harvests instead of horrors. But reminders of the conflict, rusted helmets, fragments of artillery, continued to surface for decades. For the veterans who survived, the journey home marked the beginning of another struggle. Many bore wounds both visible and invisible. The physical scars, missing limbs, damaged lungs, shattered bodies, were matched by the burdens carried in their minds. Life after the Somme was not a simple return to normalcy. It was a daily negotiation with memory and loss. Some found solace in camaraderie, gathering in regimental associations, while others withdrew, haunted by what they had seen and endured. The impact of the battle rippled through the region and beyond. Villages and towns along the front slowly rebuilt, their ruins a testament to resilience. Memorials rose from the ashes, stone and marble tributes to the fallen, standing watch over the fields where so many had fought and died. For generations, the Somme would serve as a symbol of sacrifice, of the horrors of modern warfare, and of the enduring human spirit. Even now, a century later, the echoes of the Somme remain. The land remembers, the scars endure, and the legacy of those who fought is written into the very soil of northern France. The aftermath was not just a closing chapter, but the beginning of a long process of healing, one that shaped the landscape, the people, and the memory of a world forever changed.